Welcome to this summary of Influence, The Psychology of Persuasion by Dr. Robert Cialdini, a groundbreaking exploration of the hidden forces that shape our decisions and behaviors. This book isn't just a guide to understanding persuasion, it's a masterclass in recognizing the subtle cues and techniques that influence us every day. Whether it's a salesperson convincing you to buy something, a friend persuading you to help out, or even an ad nudging you to click buy now, these principles of influence are everywhere. By understanding them, you can protect yourself from manipulation, make better decisions, and even become a more effective communicator in your own life. So, if you've ever wondered why you said yes when you meant to say no, this is a conversation you don't want to miss. Stick around to learn how these 6 principles of persuasion, reciprocation, commitment, social proof, liking, authority, and scarcity impact everything from the way we shop to the way we live. Chapter 1 of Influence. The Psychology of Persuasion by Robert Cialdini is all about uncovering what Cialdini calls the weapons of influence, or the psychological triggers that shape how we respond to the world around us. He opens with a fascinating observation. Much like animals respond to specific signals with predictable behaviors, humans often react in similarly automatic ways to certain stimuli. These shortcuts, or fixed action patterns, help us navigate an overwhelming world of decisions quickly and efficiently. But, as Cialdini points out, they can also be exploited by those who understand how to push the right buttons. The chapter begins with an intriguing story about an Arizona jewelry store that couldn't sell a collection of turquoise pieces. After all the usual sales tricks failed, the store owner hastily scribbled a note to cut the prices in half before leaving for a trip. However, the clerk misread the note and doubled the prices instead. To everyone's surprise, the jewelry sold out at the higher price. Why? Because, in the minds of the tourists shopping there, expensive equals good. This story introduces one of the core ideas of the book. We rely on mental shortcuts to make decisions, especially when we lack the expertise or time to evaluate every detail. This reliance is efficient most of the time, but it also leaves us vulnerable to manipulation. Cialdini delves into the science of these automatic responses, drawing parallels to animal behavior. For instance, mother turkeys instinctively care for their chicks based on the cheep-cheep sound they make. Even a stuffed predator emitting this sound can trigger a maternal response. While humans operate on a more complex level, we are still susceptible to these kinds of psychological triggers. A simple word like because, as shown in a study involving people waiting to use a photocopier, can make us more likely to comply with a request even if the reason provided is trivial or nonsensical. Cialdini then reveals how skilled persuaders, salespeople, advertisers, fundraisers, and even con artists use these weapons to their advantage. They understand that human decision-making often operates on autopilot, relying on ingrained rules and patterns. These professionals can craft situations that activate our automatic responses, compelling us to comply without realizing we've been influenced. What's particularly striking is how subtle and effortless this process can be. Cialdini compares it to jiu-jitsu. Rather than applying brute force, skilled persuaders leverage the natural tendencies already present in their targets. One of the key psychological mechanisms explored in the chapter is the principle of contrast. Cialdini uses simple examples to illustrate how our perceptions of value or weight can be influenced by what we experience beforehand. For instance, when you lift a heavy object and then lift a lighter one, the second object feels even lighter than it actually is. In the world of persuasion, this principle is applied constantly. A salesperson might show you an expensive suit first, making the price of a $95 sweater seem negligible in comparison. Similarly, real estate agents often start with set-up properties, rundown houses priced too high so that the actual target property appears like a great deal. The lesson here is clear. While these mental shortcuts help us navigate a complex world, they also make us susceptible to manipulation. Cialdini isn't suggesting we abandon these patterns entirely after all. They're often effective, but he does want us to recognize when they're being used against us. Awareness is the first step toward regaining control over our decisions. By pausing to evaluate whether a response is genuinely justified or simply automatic, we can avoid falling into the traps set by those who exploit our psychological wiring. This chapter serves as a powerful introduction to the subtle yet potent forces of influence in our lives. It's a reminder that while the click, of automatic behaviors may make life easier, it also pays to think critically, especially when someone is trying to sell us something, ask for a favor, or convince us to act. Now that we've uncovered how people use psychological weapons of influence to guide our automatic responses, it's time to dive into the first major principle of persuasion: reciprocation. Why is it that when someone gives us something, even if it's small or unsolicited, we feel almost compelled to return the favor? Let's explore how this deeply ingrained rule shapes our decisions in ways we often don't realize. Chapter 2 of Influence. The Psychology of Persuasion dives into the first major weapon of influence: reciprocation. At its core, this principle is simple. When someone gives us something, we feel compelled to give something back. It's a fundamental social rule, one that underpins human relationships and cooperation. From childhood, we're taught that failing to return a favor is impolite, even shameful, and this deep-seated obligation plays a huge role in how we interact with others. While this rule is a powerful force for good, helping societies function smoothly, it's also ripe for exploitation, and Cialdini masterfully reveals how this happens. He kicks off the chapter with an experiment that perfectly illustrates the principle. A professor sent Christmas cards to complete strangers, and what happened? He received a flood of cards in return despite the recipients having no idea who he was. This small act of kindness triggered a sense of obligation in these strangers, compelling them to reciprocate without hesitation. It's this automatic response that makes reciprocation so effective. When someone gives us something, even if it's small or unsolicited, we feel an immediate and almost unavoidable urge to repay them in some way. Cialdini explains that this rule of reciprocation is universal, found across cultures and societies, and has deep evolutionary roots. In ancient times, sharing resources ensured survival. If one person shared food or protection, it increased the likelihood that their favor would be returned in the future, creating strong social bonds. But in the modern world, this same mechanism can be weaponized by those who understand its power. Take, for example, the Hare Krishna Society. In the 1970s, they revolutionized their fundraising tactics by handing out small gifts, often a flower, to passers-by in public places before asking for donations. The flowers were cheap and often unwanted. Many recipients discarded them in nearby trash bins, but that didn't matter. The act of giving the flower activated the reciprocity rule, making people feel obligated to donate money, even if they didn't support the cause. The strategy was wildly successful, bringing in substantial funds for the group, and it's a textbook example of how reciprocation can be used to influence behavior. Cialdini also shares another study to highlight just how powerful this principle can be. In an experiment, a participant named Joe offered a fellow participant a Coca-Cola as a friendly gesture, even though it wasn't requested. Later, when Joe asked this person to buy raffle tickets from him, they purchased significantly more than those who hadn't been given the Coke. The need to repay the earlier favor outweighed other factors, including how much the participants liked Joe. Even those who didn't particularly care for him still bought tickets, driven by the need to clear their psychological debt. What makes reciprocation especially potent is that it works even when the initial favor is unwanted. Cialdini points out that this dynamic can create unfair exchanges. A small gesture like giving a flower or a Coke can compel someone to offer something much larger in return, such as a donation or a purchase. This imbalance is what makes the principle so effective for persuaders. Once the rule is triggered, it's hard to resist. The most striking example of reciprocation comes from history. Cialdini recounts how Ethiopia, despite facing famine and hardship in 1985, sent $5,000 in aid to Mexico after a devastating earthquake. The reason? In 1935, Mexico had supported Ethiopia when it was invaded by Italy. The sense of obligation transcended decades, geography, and even Ethiopia's own dire circumstances. That's the power of reciprocation. It binds people and groups in a web of mutual exchange, often defying logic or immediate self-interest. But this chapter isn't just about recognizing how we're influenced. It's also about how to navigate this force. Cialdini emphasizes the importance of awareness. When someone gives us something, it's worth asking, is this genuinely a gift, or is it a tool to elicit compliance? By pausing and critically evaluating the intent behind the gesture, we can decide whether reciprocation is truly warranted. Ultimately, Chapter 2 highlights the dual nature of reciprocation. It's a cornerstone of human cooperation and a force for good, but it's also a tool that can be manipulated by those seeking to influence us. Whether it's a free sample at a grocery store, a small favor from a coworker, or an unexpected gift from a stranger, the obligation to reciprocate can shape our choices in ways we don't always recognize. And, as Cialdini makes clear, knowing when and how to step back from this automatic response is the key to staying in control. Feeling obligated to repay a favor is a powerful motivator. But what happens when we take that first small step of commitment? How can a single yes lead us down a path of consistent behavior that we never intended? In Chapter 3, we'll explore the fascinating ways commitment shapes our actions and how understanding this can help us resist being led astray. Chapter 3 of Influence. The Psychology of Persuasion explores the principle of commitment and consistency, revealing how our need to align our actions with our past behavior can be used to influence us. At the heart of this principle is the idea that humans are wired to value consistency. Once we make a decision or take a stand, we feel an internal and external pressure to act in ways that match that commitment. This tendency, while often beneficial in simplifying our decision-making and building reliable habits, can also lead us to make choices that are not always in our best interest. Cialdini introduces this concept with the example of how small initial commitments can snowball into larger actions. He highlights a clever experiment involving residents of a California neighborhood. Researchers first asked some residents to put a small 3-inch sign in their windows that read, "Be a safe driver." A few weeks later, these same residents were asked to display a large, unsightly billboard on their lawns promoting safe driving. Astonishingly, over 75% agreed, compared to only 17% of people who hadn't been approached with the smaller request first. The initial, seemingly insignificant commitment to display the small sign created a self-image of being someone who supports safe driving, which then compelled them to stay consistent with this identity by accepting the larger request. Cialdini explains that this principle is powerful because it taps into our desire to avoid cognitive dissonance, the uncomfortable feeling of acting in a way that contradicts our beliefs or values. Once we commit to something, even in a minor way, we start to see ourselves as the kind of person who aligns with that commitment. This self-perception influences future decisions, often without us realizing it. For example, agreeing to sign a petition or participate in a survey might seem harmless, but it subtly reshapes how we see ourselves and makes us more likely to comply with related requests later on. One of the most insidious applications of this principle, Cialdini notes, is in sales tactics. Car dealerships, for instance, often exploit the power of commitment by initially getting a buyer to agree to a seemingly attractive deal. Once the buyer has committed to purchasing the car, possibly even visualizing themselves driving it or telling friends about their new vehicle, the salesperson might inform them of an error in the pricing or additional fees. Even though the final price may be higher than the buyer initially expected, they're more likely to follow through on the purchase because they want to remain consistent with their earlier decision. Cialdini also shares a darker example from wartime brainwashing techniques used on American POWs in Chinese prison camps during the Korean War. The captors didn't start by asking the prisoners to make large anti-American statements. Instead, they began with small steps like asking them to agree that America isn't perfect. Once the prisoners complied with these minor commitments, they were gradually led to make larger concessions and even write public statements against their own country. By carefully escalating the level of commitment, the Chinese were able to create a sense of consistency that fundamentally shifted the prisoners' perceptions and actions. The chapter also emphasizes how written commitments are particularly powerful. When we put something in writing, it feels more real and permanent, solidifying our sense of responsibility to act consistently with it. This is why many organizations and campaigns encourage people to sign pledges or write down goals. The act of writing engages us more deeply and creates a psychological contract that's hard to break. Cialdini doesn't just highlight how commitment and consistency can be exploited. He also provides insights into how we can protect ourselves. The key, he suggests, is to recognize when these principles are being used against us and to pause before agreeing to small initial commitments. It's important to ask, Does this commitment genuinely reflect my beliefs and values, or am I being manipulated into compliance? By staying mindful of the long-term consequences of even minor agreements, we can resist falling into patterns that don't serve our true interests. Chapter 3 is a compelling exploration of how our need to appear consistent can be both a strength and a vulnerability. It shows how small steps can lead to profound changes in behavior, sometimes for good, but often in ways that serve others' agendas more than our own. By becoming more aware of this psychological tendency, we can make decisions that are truer to ourselves and avoid being swept along by commitments that might not align with our deeper goals or values. Once we've made a commitment, our actions tend to follow suit. But what happens when we're unsure of how to act in the first place? That's where social proof comes in. In Chapter 4, we'll see how looking to others for guidance can help us make decisions or lead us astray, and why this principle is so effective in both everyday life and persuasive tactics. Chapter 4 of Influence. The Psychology of Persuasion examines the principle of social proof, a powerful psychological force that shapes our decisions and behavior. At its core, social proof is the idea that we determine what is correct by observing what other people think, feel, or do. In uncertain situations, when we're not sure how to act, we look to the actions of others as a guide. While this tendency can help us make quick and often accurate decisions, it can also be manipulated to influence us in ways we might not even notice. Cialdini introduces the principle with the story of a bar owner who strategically salted his tip jar by placing a few dollars in it before customers arrived. Seeing money already in the jar made patrons more likely to tip because they assumed others had already done so. This simple, subtle tactic demonstrates how we rely on the behavior of others to validate our own actions, especially in ambiguous or unfamiliar situations. Whether it's tipping at a bar, laughing at a joke, or deciding where to eat, social proof plays a major role in guiding our behavior. The principle becomes even more compelling in situations of uncertainty or similarity. When we're unsure of what to do, we are more likely to rely on others' actions as a guide. For example, Cialdini describes a scenario in which a woman was brutally attacked in a New York neighborhood, while numerous witnesses failed to intervene. This phenomenon, often referred to as the bystander effect, occurs because everyone assumes that someone else will take action. The group's inaction reinforces individual hesitation, creating a dangerous loop of passivity. Cialdini argues that in moments like this, people are looking to one another for cues, but when no one acts, the silence becomes the signal that action is unnecessary. The power of similarity amplifies the effects of social proof. We are more influenced by the behavior of those we perceive as similar to ourselves. Cialdini illustrates this with an example from advertising. Commercials that show ordinary people enjoying a product are often more effective than those featuring celebrities because viewers see themselves in the relatable, everyday individuals. This is why testimonials from people who share our demographic, lifestyle, or experiences feel especially persuasive. They resonate on a deeper level. Cialdini also explores the use of social proof in entertainment, particularly the strategic use of canned laughter in television sitcoms. Research shows that laugh tracks, even when obviously artificial, make audiences more likely to laugh and find jokes funny. Why? Because hearing laughter signals that the jokes are amusing, prompting us to join in, even if we wouldn't have laughed otherwise. This effect underscores how social proof works on an almost subconscious level, shaping our perceptions and responses without us fully realizing it. The principle is not just a tool for marketers or entertainers, it's also leveraged in more serious contexts. Cialdini recounts how charities and fundraising campaigns use social proof to encourage donations. Statements like, 90% of people in your community have already donated, create a sense of obligation to follow suit. Similarly, online platforms exploit this principle by showing metrics such as most popular, trending, or frequently bought together, nudging us to align with what others are doing. One of the darker sides of social proof is its role in groupthink or dangerous trends. Cialdini points out how cults, riots, or even mass suicides can be fueled by the tendency to follow the crowd. In these cases, the principle of social proof overrides individual critical thinking, leading to harmful or irrational actions. The more people comply, the more powerful the social proof becomes, creating a self-reinforcing cycle. But how can we resist being overly influenced by social proof? Cialdini advises us to pay attention to context and question whether the behaviors we're observing are truly rational or just the result of conformity. For example, if you're considering buying a product because it's labeled bestseller, it's worth pausing to ask whether it's actually the best choice for your needs or if you're simply following the crowd. Similarly, in emergency situations, breaking the bystander effect often requires one person to step forward and take decisive action, which can snap others out of their passive state. Chapter 4 offers a fascinating look at how much of our behavior is shaped by the influence of those around us. Social proof, while often helpful in guiding us through uncertainty, can also be a double-edged sword. By recognizing when and how it operates, we can make more deliberate choices rather than blindly following the herd. As Cialdini shows, the key is to remain aware and critical of the social cues we're responding to because sometimes the crowd might be heading in the wrong direction. While we often rely on others for guidance, our willingness to comply becomes even stronger when we genuinely like the person making the request. But what makes us like someone? And how can this be used to influence us? Chapter 5 dives into the psychology of liking, revealing how charm, flattery, and even familiarity can nudge us towards saying yes without realizing it. Chapter 5 of Influence. The Psychology of Persuasion focuses on the principle of liking, a potent psychological force that makes us more likely to comply with requests from people we like. Cialdini explores why we tend to say yes to people we find attractive, friendly, or similar to ourselves, and how this tendency can be deliberately exploited to influence us. Liking, he explains, isn't just about superficial charm. It's a complex web of psychological factors that, when activated, can subtly guide our behavior. Cialdini begins by identifying the factors that make us like someone. Physical attractiveness tops the list, as research consistently shows that good-looking people are perceived as more trustworthy, competent, and persuasive. This is known as the halo effect, where one positive characteristic, like physical beauty, creates a favorable impression that spills over into other traits. Advertisers and marketers often capitalize on this by associating their products with attractive spokespeople or models, knowing that their allure will rub off on the brand. Similarity is another powerful factor. We are drawn to people who remind us of ourselves, whether it's through shared interests, background, or even something as trivial as dressing similarly. Salespeople, for example, often use mirroring techniques to subtly reflect a customer's language, posture, or preferences, creating a sense of connection that makes the customer more inclined to buy. This natural inclination to like those who seem like us is deeply ingrained, making it a key tool for persuasion. Cialdini also discusses the impact of compliments and praise. Flattery, even when insincere, has a remarkable ability to increase liking and compliance. When someone praises us, it boosts our self-esteem, making us more positively disposed toward them. This tactic is widely used in negotiation, marketing, and even everyday social interactions. The key takeaway here is that our desire for approval can sometimes blind us to manipulative intentions. Familiarity is another driver of liking. The more we see or interact with someone, the more we tend to like them, a phenomenon known as the mere exposure effect. This is why repeated exposure to a brand, celebrity, or idea often leads to greater acceptance and trust. Politicians, for instance, leverage this principle by ensuring their names and faces appear frequently in public spaces during campaigns. Familiarity breeds comfort, and comfort fosters compliance. Cialdini illustrates the principle of liking through real-world examples, including the Tupperware party phenomenon. At these events, the power of liking is on full display, as sales are driven not by the quality of the products but by the social bonds between attendees and the host. Guests feel a sense of obligation to support their friend, who benefits financially from their purchases. This social dynamic amplifies the influence of liking, making it a cornerstone of the Tupperware brand's success. Another striking example is how companies use association to transfer positive feelings to their products. Advertisers often link their products with things we already like, such as beloved celebrities, pleasant music, or beautiful scenery. Similarly, sports teams and patriotic symbols are frequently used to create emotional connections with brands. This tactic works because we subconsciously associate the positive feelings we have toward one thing with the product being promoted, even if the connection is entirely artificial. The chapter also delves into the dangers of the liking principle, particularly in situations where it can be used to manipulate. Cialdini warns us to be mindful of our biases and to recognize when someone is leveraging likability to influence us. He points out that liking often operates at a subconscious level, making us unaware of its effect. By becoming more conscious of this tendency, we can pause and evaluate whether our decisions are based on genuine reasons or simply on how much we like the person making the request. To guard against manipulation, Cialdini suggests separating the person from the request. When faced with a decision, ask yourself, would I still agree to this if it came from someone else? By focusing on the merits of the offer rather than the likability of the person presenting it, you can make more rational choices. In Chapter 5, Cialdini highlights just how much of our decision-making is influenced by the people we like. Whether it's a friend, a salesperson, or a celebrity, the principle of liking shapes our behavior in profound ways. While it's a natural and often positive part of human interaction, it's also a tool that can be used to sway us. By understanding this principle and remaining vigilant, we can ensure that we stay in control of our decisions and aren't unduly influenced by charm, flattery, or familiarity. As much as we like to think we're independent thinkers, there's one force that often trumps even our personal preferences: authority. Why do we follow orders, trust experts, or comply with those who exude confidence? Chapter 6 takes a closer look at how authority influences our behavior and how to spot when this power is being used for manipulation. Chapter 6 of Influence. The Psychology of Persuasion explores the principle of authority, a psychological force that compels us to comply with the directives or suggestions of people we perceive as authoritative. Cialdini highlights how humans have an inherent tendency to obey authority figures, a behavior rooted in societal structures and evolutionary survival. While this deference to authority can be essential for maintaining order and ensuring expertise-driven decisions, it can also make us vulnerable to manipulation when authority is used strategically or deceptively. The chapter opens with the iconic Milgram experiments, a chilling demonstration of how far people will go to follow authority, even when it conflicts with their personal values. In these experiments, participants were instructed by an authority figure to deliver increasingly painful electric shocks to another person. Despite hearing cries of pain or silence, indicating potential harm, a staggering 65% of participants continued administering shocks simply because they were told to do so. Cialdini uses this to show how the presence of an authoritative figure, wearing a lab coat and speaking with confidence, can override our moral instincts. What gives authority figures such power? Cialdini identifies 3 primary markers of authority: titles, clothing, and trappings. Titles, like doctor, professor, or CEO, immediately convey expertise and credibility, often influencing us before we critically assess the individual's actual knowledge. Clothing plays a similar role. Uniforms or professional attire act as visual signals of authority. A person in a suit, for example, can wield more influence in a negotiation than someone in casual clothing. Trappings, such as expensive cars, luxury items, or prestigious affiliations, also signal status and command respect. These markers act as shortcuts in our minds, saving us the effort of evaluating authority more deeply. Cialdini illustrates this with several real-world examples. In one study, pedestrians were more likely to jaywalk after seeing a man in a business suit cross the street illegally than when the same man was dressed casually. The suit acted as a visual cue, signaling authority and making others unconsciously follow his lead. Similarly, Cialdini recounts an experiment in which a man parked a luxury car in front of a line of traffic. Drivers behind him waited significantly longer before honking than they did with an ordinary car, showcasing how status symbols can subtly influence our behavior. The principle of authority is also widely used in advertising and marketing. Companies often enlist doctors, scientists, or other experts to endorse their products, even if the connection is superficial. Think of ads that feature a doctor recommending a specific toothpaste or a scientist discussing the benefits of a skincare product. While these endorsements may carry an air of credibility, They're often carefully constructed to exploit our trust in authority. Cialdini also delves into the potential dangers of blind obedience to authority. One poignant example involves the 1978 Jonestown Massacre, where more than 900 members of the People's Temple cult followed their leader, Jim Jones, to commit mass suicide. Jones's charismatic authority over his followers suppressed their critical thinking, demonstrating the catastrophic consequences of unchecked compliance. This and other historical events underline the importance of questioning authority, particularly when it leads to harmful or irrational outcomes. But why do we comply so readily? Cialdini explains that obeying authority has been ingrained in us through evolution and social conditioning. In early human societies, listening to experts or leaders often meant survival, whether it was following a knowledgeable hunter or a wise elder. Similarly, modern societies function on the premise that obeying laws, rules, and those in positions of authority ensures order and stability. However, this automatic deference becomes problematic when authority is misused or when symbols of authority are faked. To protect ourselves from being exploited by the principle of authority, Cialdini offers actionable advice. First, recognize the authority figure's credentials and expertise, but don't stop there. Question whether their authority is genuinely relevant to the situation. Just because someone has a title or wears a uniform doesn't mean they're infallible. Second, assess their motives. Are they acting in your best interest, or are they leveraging their authority to serve their own agenda? By pausing to evaluate these factors, we can resist automatic compliance and make more informed decisions. Chapter 6 sheds light on how deeply authority shapes our behavior, often without us realizing it. While deference to legitimate authority is necessary for navigating complex societies, blind obedience can be dangerous. By becoming more aware of how authority influences us through titles, clothing, or trappings, we can distinguish between genuine expertise and manipulative tactics. Cialdini's message is clear. Respect authority, but don't let it override your own judgment. In an increasingly complex world, maintaining a healthy skepticism is essential to staying in control of our decisions. We've seen how authority can command compliance, but sometimes it's not about who's asking, it's about how scarce the opportunity seems. In Chapter 7, we'll explore the principle of scarcity, where the fear of missing out drives us to act faster than we think. From limited-time offers to exclusive deals, let's uncover why we're wired to want what we can't have. Chapter 7 of Influence. The Psychology of Persuasion focuses on the principle of scarcity, one of the most powerful psychological triggers that drives human behavior. At its core, the scarcity principle is simple. The less available something is, the more we want it. Whether it's limited-time offers, exclusive products, or rare opportunities, scarcity creates a sense of urgency and increases perceived value. This chapter explores why scarcity is so effective and how it is strategically used to influence our decisions. Cialdini opens by explaining the psychological basis of scarcity, our aversion to losing freedoms or opportunities. When we perceive that something is in short supply, our natural reaction is to act quickly to secure it, often without pausing to evaluate whether we truly need it. This is rooted in the human fear of loss, which tends to outweigh the potential pleasure of gain. In essence, scarcity flips a mental switch, turning a casual interest into an urgent need. A famous marketing phrase, limited time offer, perfectly encapsulates this principle. Cialdini illustrates how businesses exploit scarcity by making products or services seem exclusive. Take, for example, the way airlines promote flights by showing a banner like, "Only 3 seats left at this price." This triggers an immediate response, as people fear missing out, a phenomenon often referred to as FOMO. The item itself hasn't changed in quality or utility, but the perception of its scarcity skyrockets its desirability. Cialdini also highlights the limited edition tactic, a strategy commonly used in product marketing. From luxury watches to collector's items, labeling something as limited creates the illusion of rarity, making consumers more eager to buy. It's not about needing the item, it's about wanting it before someone else takes it. Scarcity taps into a competitive instinct, turning the acquisition into a race against others. The chapter takes a fascinating turn when Cialdini explains how scarcity impacts our perception of information. He discusses an experiment in which people were given access to two sets of information, one that was widely available and another described as confidential or restricted. Even when the restricted information was of no greater quality, participants rated it as more valuable simply because it was labeled as exclusive. This illustrates how scarcity doesn't just apply to tangible goods. It also makes information feel more credible and persuasive when it's framed as secret or not for everyone. Another application of scarcity is seen in the concept of reactance, the psychological pushback we feel when freedoms are threatened or choices are restricted. For instance, when stores impose purchase limits like only 2 per customer, it makes people want the item even more. Reactance is particularly strong in children and teenagers. When something is forbidden or restricted, it suddenly becomes more attractive. Cialdini cites research showing that censorship often increases interest in the banned material, as people perceive it as more valuable or important simply because access is limited. The chapter also touches on the power of scarcity in interpersonal relationships, particularly in dating and attraction. The hard-to-get approach plays on this principle, as people often value potential partners who seem selective or unavailable. This scarcity effect creates a perception of higher worth, leading to greater pursuit and interest. Cialdini explains that the allure of scarcity in relationships isn't just about availability but also about the desire for something unique and irreplaceable. However, scarcity can have downsides when used manipulatively. Cialdini warns of high-pressure sales tactics that exploit this principle to push people into decisions they might later regret. For example, salespeople often create false scarcity by suggesting that a deal will disappear if it's not taken immediately. This sense of urgency overrides rational thinking, leading consumers to act impulsively out of fear of missing out. To counter the manipulative effects of scarcity, Cialdini offers some practical advice. First, pause and evaluate whether the item or opportunity is genuinely scarce or if it's an artificial tactic designed to pressure you. Ask yourself if you truly want or need the item, regardless of its availability. Second, focus on the intrinsic value of the product or decision. Would you still desire it if it were widely available? By grounding your decisions in rational thought, you can avoid being swept up in the frenzy of scarcity-driven urgency. Chapter 7 ultimately highlights how scarcity taps into deep-seated psychological impulses, making it one of the most persuasive tools in influence. From marketing strategies to personal relationships, the principle of scarcity shapes much of how we make decisions. Cialdini's insights encourage us to recognize when this principle is being used against us and to regain control over our choices. While it's natural to want what's rare, the key is to determine whether it's truly worth having or simply an illusion of value crafted by the scarcity effect. That wraps up our deep dive into Influence, the Psychology of Persuasion by Robert Cialdini. The key takeaway? Persuasion isn't just about flashy ads or clever arguments, it's rooted in deep psychological principles that drive our behavior in ways we often don't even notice. By understanding how reciprocation, commitment, social proof, liking, authority, and scarcity work, you'll be better equipped to recognize when someone's trying to influence you, and you'll also know how to use these tools ethically in your own life. This book is a powerful reminder that awareness is the first step toward control. When you understand the forces that drive your decisions, you're not just reacting to the world, you're shaping it on your terms. If you found this summary helpful, let us know. Like this video, drop a comment sharing your favorite takeaway, and subscribe to our channel for more engaging book breakdowns. Don't forget to share this with someone who could use a little extra insight into the art of influence. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.